These files were never meant to be public, but someone reopened them. This is the Dark Bureau. Vatican City, barely half a square kilometre, lies at the heart of Rome. A spiritual hub, crowned with golden domes, echoing centuries of history. To the outside world, it is synonymous with sanctity, tradition, and ritual. Tourists stream beneath sprawling colonnades, drawn by the promise of art and ancient liturgy. But beneath the gilded altars and echoing basilicas exists another reality, a sovereign financial empire whose true scope lingers far beyond stained glass windows. This minuscule city-state, walled off from the turbulence beyond, commands hidden resources capable of unsettling global markets, and it does so almost entirely out of sight. While the public sees solemn papal blessings and ornate processions, a complex network of assets moves, unchecked and largely untaxed, shifting between continents with astonishing agility. Appearances are carefully maintained. The Vatican presents itself as a humble steward, collecting annual donations for parish missions and charitable causes. Yet even a cursory glance at the balance sheet reveals the contradiction. Charitable revenues fall infinitely short of the massive property empire assembled over decades. Each new acquisition, a wing in Manhattan, an estate in Paris, an anonymous parcel in Buenos Aires, layers new questions onto an already opaque structure. There are donations and bequests on the surface, but profits vanish into offshore accounts and foreign holding companies, obscured by centuries-old privileges. If this is the world's most influential religious institution, why does its accounting bear the hallmarks of a global holding company? Behind every transfer, there is always more to the story. Trusts in Switzerland, bank accounts in Liechtenstein, foundations named for long-dead cardinals, but directing funds to luxury real estate. Secrecy is not just tradition, it is systemic. Rigid security lines the Vatican offices, where insiders handle sensitive documents under guarded eyes, behind sealed doors. Memory cards containing detailed ledgers move between desks under layers of clearance. Physical files migrate from locked cabinets to hidden safes. The guardians of this system are not merely priests, but professionally trained managers and forensic accountants, accustomed to the opacity of international finance. Every so often, a file slips through, a coded ledger here, a faded deed there. Meanwhile, a wider network of external investigators assembles scattered evidence. Receipts dug out of distant land registries, notarized invoices from global capitals, payroll slips for unidentified staff. For every revealing scrap, a dozen more slip through the cracks. The design is ingenious. Plausible deniability layered with centuries of inertia. The numbers alone command respect. Even as late as 2021, the administration known as the Roman Curia directly managed over $5 billion in assets, conservatively estimated. Factor in associated church holdings, charitable organisations, and diocesan portfolios from continents apart, and that number balloons to upwards of 30 billion. These are not conventional piles of cash, but carefully diversified assets, corporate shareholdings, blue-chip funds, and most crucially, prized real estate that withstands economic shocks. The Vatican's complicated legal structure spreads ownership across over 100 shell companies and tiered foundations. Asset trails fork through London, Paris, New York, and Latin America, changing hands between trusts or thinly masked as charitable front organisations. Meanwhile, parish donations collected in cash on a Sunday might eventually underwrite the purchase of a high-rise in the world's most competitive property markets. Neither tenant nor neighbour suspects the true source of their landlord's authority. Legal insulation is total, allowing vast influence without direct accountability. At the heart of it all stands the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Vatican Bank. Surrounded by architectural relics and security technology decades old, the bank advertises altruistic aims to manage the funds of Catholic missions and orders, ensuring church resources are protected and distributed according to sacred need. But for much of its modern history, the reality is far less transparent. Internal audits have revealed that at one time, more than 50% of accounts were held by nebulous religious organisations whose direct charitable activity was impossible to verify. This pattern extended into lending relationships, offshore transfers, and discrete property purchases. The bank is not subject to Italian regulatory oversight. Centuries-old treaties and sovereign rights grant immunity from almost any external inquiry. When suspicious wires flowed through Roman banks, all it took was a Vatican letterhead to make investigations slide to a halt. For decades, this immunity functioned as a firewall. Prosecutors watched transparently questionable transactions, but could not intervene. The system's structural resilience emerged in times of crisis. In recent financial collapses, Latin American inflation shocks, the Great Recession, Vatican-linked property quietly increased in value, outperforming local and even global benchmarks. As asset prices plummeted elsewhere, new trust vehicles appeared, taking vulnerable hotel chains, office buildings, and urban plots under Vatican-adjacent ownership. Proceeds from religious funds would be wired into offshore accounts, then routed to major European banks, masked by layers upon layers of corporate intermediaries and legal proxies. To outsiders, the explanation was always prudent diversification, but for those following the flow, the reality was plain. Endless recycling of donations and profits into luxury holdings, made invisible by the sheer density of legal obfuscation. As the system expanded, scrutiny mounted. A new generation of internal auditors, many with professional backgrounds in global banks, were brought in under a reform mandate. Almost immediately, tens of millions in untraceable transactions surfaced, routed through Liechtenstein and other secrecy jurisdictions. Rental proceeds from Vatican-controlled buildings bypassed Italian authorities, redirected as consulting fees or project advances to foundations with a tenuous existence. Such revelations cracked the image of responsible stewardship. Italian and Swiss judicial authorities demanded access. But centuries-old sovereignty formed an unbreachable bulwark. Letters from prosecutors were met with silence, or ancient legal doctrines shielding church property from secular courts. A critical break came with a trove of leaked documents, contract signatures, property purchase agreements, and wiring instructions, all annotated in code. These files detailed complex South American real estate deals, where Vatican-affiliated companies bought land, then flipped it at artificially high prices to subsidiaries in Europe. The profits, never declared as charitable income, circled back into accounts shielded by Luxembourg's trust laws or Caribbean mailbox companies. Distilling ownership down to a single person was impossible. Beneficiaries were shadowed behind proxies. Board members recruited from far-flung villages, all paper trails ending at post office boxes or generic registered addresses. In one particularly revealing case involving central London property, the chain of ownership ran through a succession of shell companies spanning Switzerland, Luxembourg, and ultimately returning to Vatican City, with not a single real owner listed, except for anonymous legal representatives. This lack of transparency triggered concern among global and European money laundering authorities. International task forces mapped property acquisitions, finding irregular spikes in purchases linked to the Vatican network during periods of economic instability. In Milan, Italian investigators traced bundles of notarized paperwork through brass-plated office suites and scanned international courier receipts, finally matching contract fonts and printer serial numbers to records kept inside the Apostolic Palace. Compliance officers reported a game of legal cat and mouse. Every time authorities closed a loophole, a new company structure appeared, sidestepping reporting obligations. Some actors inside the Vatican worked diligently for improvement, instituting new controls, But the environment favoured opacity. Compliance measures rarely reach the entities with the greatest capacity for concealment. The game changed with the eruption of the so-called London scandal. Senior Vatican officials masterminded the acquisition of a luxury building in one of London's wealthiest districts. A transaction worth more than $200 million, abetted by brokers and advisors with little to no public accountability. When the details surfaced, allegations of fraud, kickbacks and gross mismanagement emerged alongside hints of secret negotiations and off-the-record settlements. Unlike earlier incidents, the losses were impossible to hide, even from the faithful. The transaction collapsed, with enormous sums unaccounted for and reputations in tatters. Public indignation soared. International bank partners rapidly distanced themselves, raising their own accountability standards for religious clients. For the first time in modern memory, the Vatican organised internal criminal proceedings. Yet the process, convened behind closed doors, managed by tribunal judges long insulated from outside review, was shielded by centuries-old discretion. Outcomes were sanitised for public consumption, sometimes released in cryptic summaries, with many defendants maintaining silence behind the legal protection of the Church. News of settlements, often involving high-level Vatican staff and global banking institutions, trickled out in leaks and off-the-record interviews, but the underlying structure of secrecy endured. Government regulators, banking consortia and non-profit watchdogs seized on the London case as a template for broader concern. It illustrated how venerable religious institutions, left unchecked, could become vehicles for international financial risk, regardless of mission or intent. The institutional consequences rippled outward. Financial authorities in the EU, the UK, and several Latin American nations no longer took Vatican claims of transparency for granted. Deep dive audits into organisations with tangential, Holy See ties were conducted. In several countries, charity watchdogs flagged suspiciously layered trusts, warning donors and requiring greater disclosure. Even some internal Vatican commissions, alarmed by the scale and sophistication of the financial techniques exposed, called for root and branch reforms, independent annual audits, public reporting, mandatory external compliance reviews. Whistleblowers, including those still in the priesthood or laity, described an ingrained culture of silence, plausible deniability institutionalised in job roles, ethics forms, and even informal codes among the staff. For millions of Catholics and wider donors, such revelations wrought deep disquiet. Many gave tithes, trusting their gifts would help the impoverished or support educational and medical efforts worldwide. Instead, vast sums evaporated into the Church's labyrinthine asset networks, with only a fraction ever emerging as visible aid. Multiple independent investigations found that, in some years, actual dispersed charity amounted to less than 10% of revenue, while the rest propelled further expansions and acquisitions. The architecture of financial secrecy, built up over centuries and enforced by law and habit alike, had become so dense that virtually no one outside a shrinking circle of Vatican insiders truly grasped the scope. Institutional responses unfolded slowly and often haltingly. Publicly, Vatican spokespersons and newly appointed auditors promised stricter internal oversight, stronger governance, more transparent annual budgets, and new anti-money laundering protocols. Yet external reviews consistently pointed to persistent blind spots, parts of the organisation legally outside the reach of even the Pope's own reformers, shielded by doctrinal privileges and independent canon law jurisdictions. Key questions remained unresolved. Could reforms keep pace with the capacity for concealment, or would reforms linger on paper while the machinery of secrecy grinds on, refined with each generation? The consequences reverberate through the Catholic world and beyond, both as a financial matter and as a crisis of legitimacy. For global regulators, the Vatican serves as a test case for whether any historic, sovereign or religious institution can function as both moral authority and unaccountable investment fund. New generations of donors demand visibility, and institutions worldwide look for lessons about how legal and charitable forms can obscure as much as they reveal. And for the faithful, a difficult reckoning continues. Can the ideals of faith be reconciled with the realities of a financial empire whose boundaries are drawn not just by purpose, but by precision-engineered secrecy? The final question hovers over Vatican City, as it has through eras of reform and resistance. If the global network of assets and trusts is now integral to the Church's identity, can such a structure ever be made fully visible? Or does the Vatican prove that certain forms of power will always remain untouchable, a legacy of spiritual authority, entwined with the world's most ancient architecture of concealment? The answer will measure not only the future of the Catholic Church, but the fate of financial transparency whenever belief meets the machinery of modern money.